It's a beautiful day here in the sunny south of Ireland. So we are here at the beach. It's too hot to be indoors, so we're here at the beach and we're going to talk about Omega and Rolex. So guys, I hope you're all keeping well. Today we are going to talk about one of the age-old questions in our field, and that is whether Omega is better than Rolex. Now, for years, decades even, the answer to that question would have been no. But these days, I think Omega are making a compelling case, and Rolex aren't doing themselves any favours. And I'm going to go through the reasons why I think this is so. But before we begin, it should be stated that these views that I'm going to give are my own opinion, and in reality, there is no right or wrong answer to this question, despite what the fanboys would tell you from each brand. There's no right or wrong answer, it's all subjective, it's all a matter of opinion, and the things that I'm going to talk about in this video are just my own opinion. So to answer the question, is Omega better than Rolex? In my opinion, yes, I think they are. I think for the prices that they go for, you can't get any better. Whereas with the overinflated prices of Rolex these days, it's very, very hard to justify buying one on the second-hand market. And of course, as we all know, the problems with the first-hand, buying them new from ADs, it's near impossible. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But in answering this question, there are 5 areas that I'm going to focus on, and they are build quality, design, movements, history, and accessibility and pricing. Accessibility and pricing kind of rolled into one. So starting off with build quality, and Rolex probably just does edge this one, but not by a whole lot. I've handled several models from both companies, and it just seems to be that there is less quality control issues with Rolex. Now that's not to say that there are a lot with Omega, there aren't at all, but just small tiny pieces here and there on the odd piece that you just don't really see with Rolex. So in terms of build quality, Rolex just edges that for me. So also in terms of build quality, Rolex uses 904L steel, which is a lot better than the 316L used by Omega and most other watch brands. 904L steel is much more resistant to corrosion. And in terms of gold pieces, Rolex also owns its own gold foundry, so they have a lot more control in the production of the gold that they use for their precious metal pieces. So next up we have design, and for me this is where Omega starts to come to the forefront. You know, for me, I just find Rolex's design to be a tad lazy, whereas Omega, I think there's more diversity, more variety in the models that they produce. And what I mean by this is that if you look at Rolex Seal sports models, you know, a lot of the watches could be described in the same way. And what I mean by that is black dial, circular indices, rectangular indices at 6 and 9, the 3 o'clock date wheel and the Cyclops. You know, apart from a change in bezel, that design could be used to describe the Submariner, the Sea Dweller, the Explorer 2, the GMT Master 2, the Yacht-Master. All of those watches fall into that category. Whereas I think with Omega, there is a bit more variety. For instance, take Rolex's Submariner and Sea Dweller. I'll put pictures up on the screen. 2 of those watches look very, very similar. Very similar in design. Now, if you switch to Omega's equivalents of these pieces, you have the Seamaster and you have the Planet Ocean. And if we look at these 2 watches, 2 very different designs. You know, look at the handsets are different, the dials are different, the bracelets are different. You know, there's just, for me, a lot more diversity with Omega's catalogue, and that's just something that I prefer. I think it tailors to more tastes, whereas Rolex designs, you know, tend to be very similar. Also where Omega shines in terms of design is with its dress watches. You know, Omega has 2 successful lines of dress watches. You have the Omega DeVille series and you have the now discontinued Omega Genève lines, but still popular watches. The DeVille line's still in production. The Genève line came to the end kind of late 80s. This is as opposed to Rolex, who failed miserably with the Cellini line. Completely crashed and burned, whereas Omega have been successful in that regard. So again, another area where Omega have shone where Rolex haven't. And then to finish off with the design argument, we have the Omega Seamaster Aquaterra World Timer. And for me, this is just the most beautiful watch in the world. If I could only wear one watch for the rest of my life, it would be the Aquaterra World Timer. I don't think anyone, not even Rolex or any other brand for that matter, has come close to creating a watch that is as beautiful as the Aquaterra World Timer. So for me, this is another point that goes in Omega's favor. So now we move on to movements, and again, I think Omega shines here. In terms of what they offer for the price, you can't get any better. I've spoken a lot in my recent videos about Omega's Caliber 8800 that is inside the Seamaster, and this is a watch that on the secondary market you can buy for about €4,000. And for that price, I think there is nothing better than the Omega Caliber 8800. So many of Omega's movements now are METAS certified as well as COS certified, and that's what gives them the master chronometer status. On the other hand, you have Rolex movements where they are mainly just COS certified, giving them the superlative chronometer status. But there's a lot to be said for the METAS testing. It is very rigorous, and if you see a watch with master chronometer on the dial, you know, it pretty much means that there's no beating that movement that's inside that watch. Omega also has the coaxial escapements. Now, I'm not going to go through all of what that means because I did that in my last video when I reviewed the Omega Seamaster, but essentially it just means that there's less wear and tear on the parts in the watch, and again it just means that, you know, it's going to last longer. The movement's will not need as long between servicing. You'll have longer service periods, and again it's just Omega shining and innovating, and again for the price that you can get those pieces, those movements are second to none. So I'm going to pause the watch talk right here for a minute. As I said, we're down at the beach. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get some lovely shots of the beach. There's a hill walk not far from here, so I'm also going to do that today. Try and get some lovely shots of the landscape, and I hope you enjoy them. And we will get back to talking about watches in just a minute. So moving on to history, and there really is nothing to separate these two watches. Both have made outstanding contributions to watchmaking throughout the decades. Omega was actually invented first. Omega can trace its roots all the way back to 1848 to a company called La Générale Watch Company. It then became Omega in 1903, 2 years before Hans Wilsdorf founded Rolex in 1905. So Omega obviously has all the space history with the Speedmaster. Omega also developed the world's first tourbillon wristwatch, I believe in 1947. But then, of course, Rolex is steeped in history as well, with the development of the waterproof case, the automatic movement. Rolex also had the first watch that went on the climb to Mount Everest, the watch that would later go on to be known as the Explorer line. So there really is nothing to separate them in terms of history. Both companies have a very rich history, and honestly, on this point, there is nothing to separate them whatsoever. And lastly, we move on to availability and pricing. And for me, this is where Omega takes home the gold. For the simple fact that you can walk into an AD and buy an Omega. Whereas this just doesn't happen with Rolex. So unless you spend literally 6 figures a year in a Rolex AD, you're not going to get the watches that everyone wants. You know, the Submariners, the Daytonas, the GMTs. You know, they're going to give them to someone who does spend that kind of money a year in a Rolex AD. So again, we all know the problems that Rolex has at the moment with its ADs, and this just doesn't happen with Omega. Now, I know Rolex are trying to rectify the problem by introducing rules that the clients can only buy 3 watches a year from an AD, but again, until this proves to be working and until it proves to be the case, we can't bring that into the argument. Whereas with Omega, unless it's a limited edition piece like a Snoopy or something like that, you can literally walk into an AD and buy a Speedmaster or a Seamaster or whatever model you essentially want. And then lastly, we have the price. And again, Omega wins it here. You get an awful lot of watch for your money when you buy an Omega. And unless you get a Rolex at an AD price or at retail price, you can't say the same thing for Rolex. You know, you're going to end up spending on the second-hand market 2, 3, sometimes even 4 times the retail price of a watch. It is very, very hard, for example, to justify spending 35 to 40,000 euro on a Panda Daytona when, in my opinion, you could get a second-hand, but in very good condition, Omega Speedmaster for 4 grand. There's just simply no comparison. The Speedmaster is a watch that is just as good as the Daytona, has just as much, if not more, history, and is a very well-built watch that will last you a lifetime. So of all the points, this is why I think Omega is better than Rolex. It's that last two that are most important: accessibility, availability, and pricing. You know, so the fact that you can just, you know, go and buy an Omega, it speaks a lot. And the fact that you can get them at a reasonable price as well, and not an overinflated price, again, it speaks volumes. So, you know, of the 5 areas we've looked at, I think Rolex edges it in build quality. History, there's nothing to separate them. But then in my opinion, when you look at design, movements, availability and pricing, Omega wins it all day long. And this is why I think Omega are better than Rolex. So guys, there we have it. As I said, these are just my views on whether Omega are better than Rolex, but I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. Again, it's all subjective. There's no need to resort to arguing and saying people are stupid for thinking the way they do. Again, it's all subjective and it's personal preference. And for the reasons that I've laid out in this video, I think Omega take home the gold over Rolex. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that wherever you are, it is as nice as it is here in Ireland today. Anyway, guys, have a great week, and I will see you again very soon. Until then, take care.